Hello, everyone. Welcome to New York Buddha Dharma. Right? So, what do we see when we look at a piece of paper? So he's asking what conditions created the paper. Anyone could throw out some ideas on a chain of conditions?
That's a tree.
A tree. And what were the conditions for the tree? Air, water, the earth, sunlight, rain, the clouds, the people to harvest the tree, the seal, and it goes on and on and on. And again, the person to take the tree to the pulp mill, the person that made the machine that mined the ore and the iron that smelted it to make the parts for the machine, and that person's parents and the person that grew the food. And these cones of causality go infinitely back in the past, and they go infinitely forward. And then there's another type of cause that we often overlook, that's not often pointed out, that creates that light when we throw that switch. And in Buddhism, it's called the dominant condition, which is the purpose or the intention. So I wanted to see the room, so I put the light on. So it's the intention to do something also is a cause as far as this is concerned. So we want to look at that and see that all these causes that we're going to explore are all supporting causes, not necessarily A to B to C. All right? Now, Idapakayata is how things exist. What causes things to exist? And what I mean to exist, what causes the experience of things for a person. How do we experience things? And that's dependent on, as I said, imputation, a mind to impute it, the basis, and so on. Now, we just can't impute, for instance, a camera on a stick or a piece of wood, because that wouldn't be a correct imputation. So not only when we label something or impute a label to something, it has to be according to convention, which is agreement, and also function. We can compute a camera on a machine that takes pictures, and we'd be correct, but we can't do it on a piece of wood.
Can you define impute? Because I'm playing with it in my mind. And
Yeah. To impute, it's similar to compute, but it's to imagine or to label or to create something, to think it.
To impute is to think something.
To think something. So if I impute that that's a book, or if I impute that this is a book, I would be mistaken because this would not function as a book. But I could impute it to be a vase with flowers in it. So it's basically a fancy way.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Mm-hmm.
To determine something in your mind as something is an imputation?
Absolutely. To determine something in your mind is an imputation. That is to impute it. So now the 12 links, or Paticca Samuppada, is how or what is the cause of suffering. What are the conditions that cause suffering to arise? And that's what we're going to look at as much as possible tonight in the time that we have. And that's where we're going to go right now. So, and we have maybe a couple of fun games that we can play. And if you get tired with this, I can tell you a joke to lighten things up a little bit. I've been known to do that. So you have the little charts with the circle. And just for reference sake, You notice that they're done in a circle, so each one leads to the other, and it goes around and around and around. Usually, it starts at number 1, which is the first one that's usually listed, which is ignorance. It goes to mental formations, consciousness, and so on, and then back to the 12th, which is back to old age and death, and then back to ignorance, which is number 1 again. The first few, I think, are the most complicated and the deepest to understand. So why don't we start where things are a little more familiar to us and to teachings that you've probably heard before. And we'll start with number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 6 sense basis. All right, everybody see that? And there's a list below it too. So we're going to start with that. Taste. And in Buddhism, the sixth sense, anybody know what that is, Lane?
Mental.
We consider the mind or mental sensations to be the sixth sense. So it's 5 physical senses and 1 mental sense. When a sense door or a sensory organ comes in contact with a sense object and with consciousness, when these 3 come together, that sense basis is the condition for contact, which I just described. So it's just to have an eye doesn't help you. It's when it comes together with a sense object. Make sense? Now, when contact takes place, it is the supporting condition for feeling. Have anyone this familiar to some of you? No? Okay, this is basic Abhidharma type stuff. So it's great. I'm glad we started here. So from contact, and this is also a description of the 4 Noble Truths, and it's also a description of the 5 aggregates, which we're going through, if you're familiar with that. If you're not, we're learning it right now. So from contact, there is the condition for feeling. And it's not an emotional feeling. In Buddhism, this feeling is described as one of 3 types. It's either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. I like it, I don't like it, or I don't notice it. Any contact will create one of these feelings. Everyone with me so far? This is where it starts to get interesting and where we start to get into problems, or we can get into problems. From feeling, the next thing that feeling is the condition for is craving or desire. And we're also looking at attachment. Now, again, in basic Buddhism, this is one of the 3 poisons: attachment and aversion, or attachment and hatred is sometimes called. But it's basically you want it or you want not to have it. Both ways are positive and negative, but they're both the same thing. There's a desire. It's not to experience or desire to continue to experience, based on the feeling tone. With me so far? Feeling then develops into something we call clinging. And it's very similar to craving, but the difference is craving is kind of like, oh, I noticed that would be nice. I kind of want that. Where clinging is, I must have this. I will not be happy if I don't. Or if this goes on for one more moment, I can't stand it. I can't live this way. This is intolerable. So it's a very strong feeling of I must have or I must not experience such a thing. Now, in Buddhism, craving and grasping is considered to be one of the roots of suffering. Now, something else happens here. When we want something, we split the world into two parts. This is where we get into something called duality and non-duality. Does this ring a bell with anyone? Okay. The world is ultimately a non-dual system. For us to comprehend and model it, we break it into parts, into causes, and into mental imputation of objects. We break things down into good and bad. We break things down into this and that. This is how we function when we talk about labeling or naming through language. As soon as we say something is something, we're saying there is something else that's not that. This is how we create and form identity. An identity means for something to be unique or to have an individual basis. So you can't identify something as being something if it's dependent upon something else, or its nature depends on something, because it wouldn't be separate from it. It would be connected, it would be the same thing. So it's like throwing the light switch is not a separate cause from the light. We think it's one and two. But it's, as we could see, it's all connected in a flow of electricity and energy and causes that create the flow of light back to the retina, the cones and so on in the eye. But when we create this sense of duality, we create something else. We create a subject and an object. That's an observer and what's observed. What's desired or wanted, and the person that wants or desires it. So what we're creating, and I'm using the word creating, is a self. We're creating this. This doesn't truly exist other than as a creation or an imputation of our mind. Now, in terms of creating a model of reality, and I use that word loosely, or a model that allows us to function as an animal, a person, a being in this world, it's extremely useful. But many problems arise from that, because we don't see it strictly as a creation of mind, as a useful tool. We see it as an inherently, we used that word before, I'm bringing it back, existent thing, object with a self nature, independent of everything else, separate and independent. And that's a misapprehension. And it has a bunch of side effects, one of which is stress and suffering. For one, it gives us the false impression, and I'll talk about stress, remind me to talk about stress. There's good news at the end of this, because you're learning how to, by understanding this, how to get out of this cycle. So, we've created this separate self. And one of the things that all beings, all human beings crave or want is a sense of connection. Our sense of well-being is determined on it. When we feel separate, apart, alone, a speck in the universe that no one could understand what it is that we feel, what we experience, that there is a barrier or a shell between us and reality out there and other people, and no one can know how I think, I can't know how anyone else thinks or feels. All I have is just this information. It's a very frightening place to be. And it's part of the human dilemma. But it's an illusion. It's deceptive. It's a useful tool for creating models, but when we take that to be who we are, we've misperceived our nature, which our Buddha nature is, our connected nature, and we've separated. The other thing that we do that's a big, big problem is this sense of self. When we start to see that we are creating it, that it's something that's created in our mind, and it just exists dependent on other things, it starts to lose its importance. Now, I'm not saying that it's not important to take care of the body, to eat, to find clothing, medicine, and to have a sense of well-being. It is. This is what we do. All of this stuff is dependent on our ability to do it. Without a body to see, there isn't any seeing. Without a nose to smell, there's no smelling. There's no smell consciousness. So it is important to do that. But the problem is we project this sense of self, since it is created. We create an idea that it exists outside of the body, outside of experience, as something above or below it. So when someone says something we don't like, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not a good dad, you're not professional, we become very upset and extremely defensive. And it creates a huge amount of stress to maintain this image we have of ourselves, this self-schema. And most of the effort and thoughts that we spend our lives on are designed around protecting and enhancing this created image of a self that really doesn't exist except as a creation of our own mind. So we're starting to see how that opens up. And let's see where this goes. From this clinging comes becoming. And this is the creation of self. From I must have, these are the actions, and you could take this to anything that you've done in your life. These are the actions that we partake in and the thoughts that we have to become the possessor of whatever it is that we desire. So that's becoming. And then the next one is birth. And of course here I'm not talking about birth of a child or an animal. I'm talking about the birth of a new sense of ego, a new sense of identity. I am now reifying this image, and I am now born as the new possessor or owner of whatever it was that I desired. I'm the owner of that car, I'm the owner of that house. I am the husband of so-and-so. I am the president of this or that. And we have a new identity, which we then, as immediately taking on that identity, comes to old age, death, grief, and despair. Because everything is constantly changing. And it takes energy to maintain these thoughts, to maintain this conception, this imputation. And as things change, we get divorced, we lose our job, the new car breaks down, is now an old car. How did that happen? I just was the owner of a new car, now I have a new identity, the owner of old. And these things are always changing, including our body as it ages and gets older. And if we identify with the young this, that, there's suffering. So anytime we create this image and try to grasp or hold on to it, we're creating suffering. From suffering and this disappointment and stress, we become lost and confused. We're not able to see clearly. And we come back around the circle to ignorance. And now we're going to go through in a minute how we got to where we were in the first place, and also how we can change that once we see it. So these two whales walk into a bar and they sit down and they're having a bunch of drinks, and after a while one whale says to the other, these are whale noises. And the other whale looks at him and says, all right, I think you've had too much. Give me your keys. So it always amuses me, but we seem to have no problem imputing the impossible situation of two whales sitting at a bar, having a drink, and one driving himself home. But we're able to do this. And it's not really much different than imputing a self. So let's play a game. And we're going to use this when I talk about sankhara, which is how the mind works and how we put together our experience of the world. And have we heard these words before? It's also, sankhara is also the fourth aggregate. So aggregates are what Buddha says a person is composed of. And that would be, the first one is form, which is our body, physical form, and our sense organs, our ability to see, to smell, to hear. So that's how we take in sensory information. That's the first one. The second one is sensation, form, sensation, correct me if I'm wrong, perception. That's, to perceive something is when we are able to name it. We can recognize what it is. I perceive that that's a chair. I perceive that's the sound of an ambulance. I perceive that this is hard. So these are perceptions. Form is just that basic raw sense data, and this is the recognition of it. So it's I perceive, I see, I understand. I see, I feel, I hear is the first one. And then the next one, aggregate, is the aggregate of feeling. That's I can sense an object, or the perception as being pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. All right, I feel. Sankhara is how we think. That's our thinking. And our mentation. And by the way, technically, feeling and perception are part of sankhara or mentation. All right? And then the final one is consciousness. So it's I feel, I hear, I see, I think, and I am conscious, I'm aware. And these 5 ever-changing processes are the basis, just as we imputed a camera on a machine that took pictures rather than a stick, we impute a self upon these 5 aggregates. Not where I wanted to go with that, but that's good. So, who wants to go first in this game? In terms of Buddhism, Christianity, so there's a lot of different ways to do it. And let's just say, if I would say, when I'm referring to consciousness in this thing, I would say we can call it knowing and awareness. We can use them interchangeably, okay? If we, can we be conscious of something without knowing it? That gets into, another conversation.
I just want to make sure we're on the same page as you.
Yeah, so yeah, I think that's a good, let's say awareness and consciousness we're going to use now interchangeably. Okay, so we're going to play with something called a schema. And again, this shows you, has to do with sankhara, how we put things together. Sankhara actually means putting together. So who wants to go first? Who would like to go first? I can go. Okay. It was a trick question. Don't look at that. And I was going to hand out like 3 or 4 of them. Just don't look at it until I tell you to. And who wants to go second? Okay. I was thinking I was going to hand out 3, 3, and 3, but we're not going to do that tonight. We have more paper than people. Okay, so I'm going to read something, and your job, all 3 of you, is to just listen. except for you, who are to now look at the paper and read it to yourself, and that's it. And then you'll listen with everybody else, and you're going to read the paper after I'm done speaking. And you don't get to see the paper until after we're all done. Okay, so that's the game. All right, so you take a look. Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, stuck like that, very good. All right, I got it? Okay. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to a lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo any particular endeavor. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications from doing too many can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure will seem complicated. Soon, however, it will become just another facet of life. It is difficult to foresee any end to the necessity for this task in the immediate future, but then one can never tell. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will have to be repeated. However, that is a part of life. Okay.
That's so true.
Now, you look at the paper. And now I'm going to ask some questions, and we'll see how we do. Did anybody, raise your hand, find it confusing? Okay. Can you tell me what you remember of this? A few things will do.
Oh, well, okay, not verbatim. Okay, good.
Yeah, if you can remember it verbatim, that's wonderful.
Okay, yeah. Okay, well, you asked her to open up the paper,
Yes.
and you seemed pleased when she got it.
Yes.
She found it.
Yeah.
Right? And then you said that she's going to be asked to do something,
Okay.
and if necessary, to go to another facility to be able to make that happen. However, not to do too many things at one time, because it could create complications, and so to do as little as possible.
Okay, stop. We obviously have a genius with a photographic memory here. I've never had this happen before with this experiment, but I'm very, very impressed. Would anyone else like to take over from that? What can you tell me, you two? Joe, can you remember anything else? That's amazing, by the way. I've never seen anyone do anything even similar to that.
Not to do too many things at once, the order may change. No, that's all.
Okay. Now, can you tell me, after that it's hard to, can you tell me what you remember of this? And
Okay, so this is a procedure that slowly becomes a part of your life, and at the beginning it might seem difficult, but actually you'll get used to it over time, and so you have to compile yourself into. It's so difficult,
yeah. Okay, great, all right. Typically, if I give this paper to a bunch of people, the people that read it beforehand can do what you did rather easily. I'm not even looking at you anymore.
Oh, God.
The people that read the paper afterwards do not have an ability to recall it or see it. Much differently than the people that didn't get the paper, or the word that created what's called the schema, all right? And I'll just say, let me just see this was done in the university as an experiment. A third of the participants just heard the paragraph, and they didn't think it made much sense and couldn't remember jack about it. Another third of the participants were told that the paragraph was about doing the laundry. Those are the people that had the paper. Basically, the ones that were given the paper that said doing the laundry were able to recall it and put it together, and it made perfect sense to them. Because they all of us have a scheme of what it is to do the laundry. We separate the darks and the whites. One goes into one machine, other goes into the other. We take them out. Once we clean it, we separate it into piles and put them in their little drawers. And then when they have to go and do it again in the future, and the process will repeat itself. We may do it at home, or we may sometimes have to go, and it's easy to remember this whole thing once you have a schema or a framework. We use these schemas or frameworks to, again, get through reality. So a schema could be of many different types. It could be a schema of what a person is. It could be a schema of Japanese people are polite. Italian people are expressive and loving, and they look a certain way, and Japanese people look a certain way. We have all these ideas. We have social schemas. We have event schemas. Social schemas, what to do on a date. We treat to dinner. We go to a restaurant. We order a glass of wine. We make small. We know how to expect things to be. We walk into a McDonald's. We walk to the counter. We don't sit down. We don't expect someone to bring us the food. So we go through life with these abbreviated things or schemas. And we also, as I was mentioned before, create from complex parts of reality and processes symbols that represent a huge amount of information. We call these things words. Right? And again, useful tools, but they can be very dangerous and misleading when we take these schemas to have certain qualities. For instance, that once we take these labels to mistake them for the process or the object, we invest a tremendous amount of time and energy in chasing after things that have no benefit for us. Whether it's something trying to fulfill our needs by looking for things that give us a temporary satisfaction. Could be drinking, could be drugs, it could be temporary successes rather than long-range goals. And we mistake a lot of meaningless things for something that doesn't give us true happiness and a sense of well-being. That quick fix, that fast food, all right, that candy bar. And this is one thing that we do. We say that new car has a quality that's going to make me happy, and we do all kinds of things to get it. And it's by wrapping these symbols and investing so much energy and creating the reality, mistaking the reality for the symbol, that all kinds of problems occur. Back to dependent origination, and let's see if we can go to this sheet which you can take home with you. This is the one with the staple, the little booklet. All right, so now we're going to start at 1 and see how far we can get. And then we'll do some questions. Okay, ignorance, which is that not knowing. The Pali word is vijja, which we've heard here before. All right, vijja, which John has talked about, is to see. Avijja means not to see. So when we're talking about ignorance, the word is avijja, and it means not seeing. We're not seeing a certain particular type of thing, and that's how things actually are, how they exist, why we behave in a particular way, and how this sense of self gets created. What we basically do is we take these symbols and this fragmentation and bifurcation of the world, and we mistake that for this flowing thusness, oneness of Rigpa, and that shining perfection that's available in presence. It doesn't hurt to be able to do things symbolically. It's necessary, but we've lost sight and we're no longer able to see that presence. And this is something that, by being aware of it, why it's so important to get back to that. And it's not a problem that symbolic thought and dualistic thought is not the problem. The problem is that we forget, or we don't know or see or realize that it is what it is. And we take it to be inherently real. That these things that are co-originated are separate. So ignorance, or this inherent quality that we see in everything, leaves no room for conscious decisions. It leaves us vulnerable to the propensity, and I love that word, propensity of our habits, all right, and our unconscious reactions. Wisdom and awareness, that ability to see, to be conscious, gives us a freedom of choice and the choice to be liberated from that. So it's a matter of the Dharma, of knowing the Dharma, of meditation, is the ability to see things as they are. So from this ignorance, this confusion, the impulse to understand arises. And we use various schema or habitual ways of seeing, just like we just frame things, and we use the format of linguistic thinking and narration to structure the world a particular way. And we get lost in that structure, and we don't realize our true nature of the world, which I can refer to now as Buddha nature, presence, Rigpa, or thusness. Not the way that we fragment it up. There aren't individual processes. Everything is interconnected. This is not a dream or a fantasy. It's something that you can observe both in meditation, and by being aware of it, you can see how these function, both causally and the way that we name things. What we take in is raw sense data. We all know this. We don't really know what's out there. Photons hit the cones in our eyes. Electrochemical pulses go down our optical nerve to parts of our brain, which creates from that an image in our mind. It's just a creation. There's no such thing out there as color. It's totally a creation. But we think these things are so real. And it's not that they're not real. It's not that this teaching is nihilistic, where it says things don't exist. It makes it very clear things do exist. And it also says things don't exist eternally. That means fixed, separate, and apart. They don't exist inherently. So it's not whether things exist or don't exist, it's how things exist, which is that they're dependently originated. And suffering is no different than anything else. It also is dependently originated, that there are causes and conditions that support it. If we understand the causes and conditions, we can break the cycle or break the chain. And in doing so, we can awaken and experience the freedom and bliss of the perfection of thusness. So, from Sankara, from this drive to separate and to know things and to create it, there has to be a knowing. And that's that objective dualistic consciousness that arises from this process of schema and linguistic dualistic thought. There's a particular type of consciousness. Buddha talks about fire as an example of it. And he says, from an oil lamp, an oil fire comes. From a brush fire, brush fire comes. From paper, a paper fire comes. From dualistic thinking, dualistic consciousness arises. Consciousness has to have a form. It has to have a way of being. And that in Buddhism is called Nama Rupa. Nama Rupa means name, which we've just understood that to be this mentality and mental imputation. And form is our physical sensations. So that's the birth in Buddhism. That's the birth or the basis of a person is Nama Rupa. And Nama Rupa breaks down into the 6 sense bases. So the 2 ways of knowing break down into the 6 ways of knowing. We've just come back to the 6th link, and we've gone all the way around. So to use this teaching in a practical way, which Lane had asked me before, is how do we take this? And it seems complicated, and I know it is, but I did my best to make notes of it. So if you are interested, you could take this home, and now you could perhaps read this or read somebody else's. Dalai Lama's got books on it. There's a lot of stuff out there. Just Google it. You'll get unlimited amount of stuff. So how is it practical? Well, it does give us the keys of how to break this chain, the cyclic existence, or samsara. By putting it in this perspective, imagine that you want to go visit a friend and you have directions and it's in a different town. And you take your car and you drive to that town and you're driving around and you can't seem to find the house. You don't have your GPS, you don't have your phone, okay? And you're driving. And you notice after about a half an hour of driving that you just passed a McDonald's with a big tree in front of it. And you remember a half an hour ago, I'm pretty sure I passed that same McDonald's. And you realize that what you've been doing is just driving around in circles. Because now you have a reference point. And you know when you get to this point where you are and what direction you've been traveling in. So it's kind of like noticing the waypoints along the way. And now you can do something about it. You can go and buy a map. You can find somebody on the street. You could say, hey, do you know where this is? Can you direct me towards that? What part of town? And you can find your way out of that circle and to where it is that you want to go. So it has a very, very practical application of it.